Welcome to the final part of my top 5 games of 2017 list, in which I discuss my second and first favorite games of the year. If you're new, I highly recommend you check out the first video on this topic where I cover all my concerns and criteria which inform how this list is structured. The simplified summary that everyone uses when doing these videos is that this is all obviously subjective and your list will be different to mine because we all think differently and like different things. All of what I say about a game is based solely on my experience with that game when I played it. And obviously I also cannot account for every update and patch and that sort of thing. I also haven't played every game in 2017, and some I've played and just haven't finished yet, such as the case with The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. That's the gist of the disclaimer, but I'd still appreciate it if you gave the start of that first video a look before proceeding for a more comprehensive understanding of my approach. Anyway, my second favorite game of 2017 is... Little Nightmares is a horror-themed puzzle platformer about a child called Six, and his/her adventure through this massive haunting facility, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. The game itself never explicitly tells you about your past, why you're here and what your goals are, but it's clear to you that something about this place is very wrong, and the assumption is that it's your quest to escape it. There's no informative dialogue or text, just exclusively environmental storytelling, and it was always intriguing for me. Evidently, the game places a huge emphasis on subtlety in this regard, almost to its detriment. There are so many theories surrounding its underlying themes, the symbolism, its characters and world. And it's fun speculating and attempting to connect the dots between all these things, whether the evidence has any merit to it or not. Sometimes it feels like the developers are getting more credit for this stuff than they deserve, because everything is so vague that it can seem like they're kind of making it up as they go along, and in retrospect, the game does have a tendency to feel like it's just moving you from one disturbing set piece to another, without much regard for consistency, and a bit of difficulty with its story pacing leads to the assumption that it wasn't always as fleshed out as you might expect. However, at the best of times, and there are a lot of great times, this place, called the Maw, can also feel like a massive, disgusting ecosystem, with all its moving parts connected in some way that you're just surviving your way through as a tiny, frail creature that can be squished in an instant. That notion is reinforced to an extent by Secrets of the Maw, a 3-part downloadable content package following another child trapped in this dreadful place. The DLC attempts to provide more context and answers to questions we didn't get in the original game, and it does help, but I finished it still feeling like there's a lot left to be seen, and that's not so bad. This world is so juicy and rich with characters and scenery, and it has the potential to be even better. Having this loose story framework in its first outing, Little Nightmares 2 can pretty much go anywhere if it gets developed. And I think it will, after seeing the small tease we got at the end of Secrets of the Maw. Other things I'd like to see addressed in a sequel is just the way the game feels to play, which obviously is a substantial part of it. There were many times in Little Nightmares where I found myself failing a particular challenge out of no fault of my own, which continuously diffuses the tension the game so desperately wants to provide. There are a couple factors contributing to this issue, namely the camera perspective and animation-based movement that just doesn't make for very responsive platforming. The whole thing was designed with the idea that the player is peering into a dollhouse of sorts, breaking the fourth wall and observing this little guy as she goes about her business. As you can see, the game isn't entirely two-dimensional, meaning you can still move in every direction. There's depth. As such, the camera needs to bob about, pan, and zoom according to where you're moving 6 within the environment, which can get subconsciously confusing with regards to the way you're meant to move the analog stick. You do have some control over the camera, allowing you to position it so you can see just a little bit of frame. Understandably, it snaps back to its intended position whenever you let go of its stick, so that you don't too easily get information about what lies ahead. Unfortunately, it's not hard to want to abuse this feature. I was compelled to use it all the time, and whenever I did, it felt like I was fighting with the controller, making everything a little bit more sticky, and granted, a lot more tense. You can just barely see around the next corner, and so you keep inching yourself just a little bit further along so that you can see just a little bit more. Little Nightmares isn't trying to be an arcadey platformer like Jak and Daxter or, like a Mario game, nor provide the same kind of thrill, fluidity, and ease that comes with climbing in games like Assassin's Creed, for example. Instead, it wants you to feel the weight of your character. The animations are brilliant, and so are the physics. I love this attention to detail more and more each time I play Little Nightmares. That slight disconnect looks and feels realistic and grounded, and thus your obstacles are all the more daunting. I understand that it is partially a design decision for things to be that way, but I like to believe that you can balance it out so that the game is more responsive, while still maintaining that aforementioned sensation. Any platformer needs a lot of fine-tuning to get it to feel right, especially in a 3D game. And I hope Tarsier continues to work on balancing the controls and feel of Little Nightmares going forward. I'm sure they will. I just hope it's not a matter of changing the fundamentals of what they have too much in order to achieve it, because, as I've explained, there's still a lot of good aspects to it at the moment. I love the manner in which Little Nightmares teaches you how to play. As with its story, it doesn't specifically tell you what to do. There are only the occasional hints, and I think it's only when you've been stuck on something for a bit too long, and that only really addresses the button layout. Instead, it slowly guides you through its systems and mechanics, building up an understanding of its controls, physics, and puzzles like some of the all-time great platformers of old do. Puzzle design in Little Nightmares is fairly simplistic and easy to figure out, therefore lacking in the kind of satisfaction you usually get from these kinds of games. However, Little Nightmares primarily uses its puzzles as a means of making you feel very small and helpless. All the mundane things that the monsters can do without second thought are a daunting undertaking for you. The puzzles mostly feel like practical activities that fit right into this world, unlike in some other games where puzzles can break immersion and be a constant reminder that you're playing a video game. That definitely has its place, but it's not what Little Nightmares is going for. This ties into the thing I adore so much about Little Nightmares, and you might think it quite superficial at first. And that's the way it's presented. The game is beautiful, both graphically and aesthetically. The lighting, shadows, textures, and post-production effects like film grain and fog. The surreal approach to architecture, furniture, and characters. Most things in the environment are distorted. skew, stretched, squashed, elongated, and compressed in order to better serve the also deformed inhabitants of the moor. Little Nightmares tries to envision objects and characters with the fear and anxiety of an innocent and ignorant child. This world is the physical manifestation of that perception, and it's so well captured. It's like the uncanny valley of structures, objects, and items, close but not quite how you'd expect them to look. It's become a bit cliched to say that a game world is a character itself, but I think that really is true in Little Nightmares. The music and sound design is equally impressive and unnerving, my favorite tracks being those which sound like they're being played on music boxes, while children chant somewhat tonelessly. Ugh, it's so gross, I love it. Whether it be, dropping a key on a wooden floor, or smashing something. It all sounds just like you'd expect it to. You wouldn't acknowledge it unless you tried, and that can be the mark of great sound design. That also applies to the next game on this list. Perhaps even more so. The production values in Little Nightmares just continue to astound me in every way. Same with my number one pick. Overall, Little Nightmares isn't the most terrifying game I've ever played, and I feel it does try quite hard to be edgy in some ways. However, it is still very unsettling and tense, and above all else, it's a master of atmosphere and tone. Everything about its art direction appeals to me on so many levels. It does struggle in the gameplay department, and often its story is a bit too vague for me to think of it as anything more than a really interesting horror game, in spite of the symbolism and thematic motifs some have claimed it contains. I love Little Nightmares, warts and all, and I will continue to praise its beautifully haunting, imaginative and original world and characters. As of right now, this is my second favorite game of 2017, taking me completely by surprise. Now, let's move on to my number one game of the year. In spite of Edith Finch being my favorite game of 2017, it's probably the one I have the least to say about, because I can only do so much to explain my appreciation and love for this game without spoiling it. This is the kind of thing you have to experience yourself to properly understand how interesting it is. I'd even recommend playing it before watching the rest of this. But if you're here, the premise is as follows.
For the first time in years, I felt like I was home.
You play as a young woman called Edith Finch, as she explores her abandoned childhood home, narrating the journey as you play, informing and reminding herself and you about what happened here and why you've come back. Each room of the house contains a story about the family member it belonged to, and these recollections of yours take the form of what is often an abstract and exaggerated minigame, for lack of a better term, that attempts to represent the way each character felt during a very significant moment in their lives. This all makes for a compelling mystery. Even once I figured out the pattern here, which should happen quite quickly for you as well, uncovering the manner in which events transpired was always enticing for me. This is a linear game, though you may not think it at first. Like Little Nightmares, it directs you very organically, not explicitly telling you where to go in this house, what to do, and most importantly, how to play each of its very distinct scenarios. This is especially commendable here, considering each scenario has a simple but nonetheless unfamiliar set of mechanics and systems that the game teaches you how to manipulate very quickly, often by using similar buttons as before or just controls which make logical sense. In spite of how unusual these scenarios can be, I was never stuck wondering what to do. The game usually gives you time to understand things with regards to the mechanics, perfectly complementing the overall tone of the game. This is a slow and melancholic tale, a leisurely process of acceptance and reflection, of growing to appreciate and savor the time one has, which I'll talk more about later. Edith Finch isn't about branching narrative paths and choice, like so many video games feel they need to be in order to stand out from other media. Instead, this game experiments with interaction in unique ways. In doing so, it's able to provide a greater sense of agency than most scripted games, even though you're often only using a few buttons at once and can only do the thing you're supposed to. It wants you to empathize with and understand the way these individuals perceive things, knowing that decision-making isn't required to have you feel involved in a story. To be fair, not all the scenarios in the game are as interesting and imaginative as others, including mechanics I've seen elsewhere. Operating a camera, for example, is a lot like operating a sniper in any other game, but the different context makes it feel more original. Furthermore, because some of these scenarios are quite short, it can't always develop enough empathy and understanding of a character. It simply lets you inhabit and physically connect with them in the moment, which I think still does a good enough job at giving you something to think about, and each of these situations has stuck with me regardless of how much I knew a character and their history. Anyway, in terms of presentation, the house is probably the most densely detailed place I've explored in a game. Each room crammed with items that tell a rich story about the person who lived there. The place is so colorful on account of that diversity in set dressing, and thus it feels inviting, in spite of the fact that it houses a dark secret. It looks like it was built by the Weasleys from Harry Potter, complete with secret passageways and misshapen towers. I'm not sure if the Weasleys had secret passageways, but you get what I mean. Usually, there are only a couple things you can interact with in each room, and most of it you just have to observe as Edith automatically remarks on whatever it is that has some relevance. I think this is a better approach than if you had to walk up to every little thing and push a button to hear her say things. That just wouldn't be natural to me. It would turn me into a completionist. Kinda like how I simply can't leave a room without searching every container in BioShock or Fallout or something. Except here, I'd be scrounging around for bits of dialogue, instead of just being in the moment and taking it all in with ease. What is here is so carefully hand-placed. Even the individual books stacked on the shelves are unique to that particular character's interests. Sometimes the rooms can make it feel like a character only identified with like one or two things, and that was just their specific quirk. But most of the time, their stories are able to provide more depth to their personality and their relationship to the others. Additionally, even though there may not always be that much time given to a certain character's minigame in compared to others, the environmental storytelling, along with other characters' scenarios, are able to flesh out things even more. Some definitely get more direct attention than others though. Giant Sparrow has taken a huge leap in the visuals department. Their first game, The Unfinished Swan, was a great example of how to use an effective, minimalistic art style in a game without it feeling like a cop-out. It was beautiful, and this game is beautiful in the opposite way. Edith Finch generally utilizes a realistic aesthetic, except for a couple stories which contain different art styles and rendering techniques that are just as impressive to look at. Things like foliage and atmospheric lighting are masterfully implemented here. Audio is also a super important thing to touch on here. The nuanced sound effects and Edith's lovely voiceover combine to create a sensual, almost ASMR experience for me.
Turns out, my mom was really good at keeping secrets.
Amplified further by another gorgeous soundtrack, this time composed by Jeff Russo, that just goes that extra mile to bring these sad stories to life.
Whatever's out there, I want you to know I'm ready for it. I'm going to appreciate all of it, especially the food. I don't mind if I only have a year left, or a month, or a single week. I'd be happy with one new day.
The music is used sparingly, meaning the game often relies only on the tangible sound effects for extended periods of time, particularly when you're exploring the house. While it is rather fantastical in terms of its modified design, which also adds to the feeling of it being lived in with lots of history, having these quiet moments devoid of music ensures you remain grounded and immersed in the house, feeling as if it's a real place, contrasting with the often surreal mini-games that are also engaging in a different way, as I described before. I cannot stress how impressive the Finch home is, just standing in it, absorbing the atmosphere, looking at pictures, hearing the sound of your footsteps. It's just all so convincing, breaking the boundary between the virtual and reality. I feel like I'm just repeating what I said about Little Nightmares and other games on this list, but it's clear that environmental storytelling is such an important thing to me, and having a game world that is extremely detailed and rich is just something that I appreciate so much. What Remains of Edith Finch may not be a happy tale. It may leave you feeling hollow, as if the story didn't have much in the way of a compelling resolution. While there are climactic moments with interesting reveals, and there is certainly a structure and flow to this narrative, Edith Finch gave me the impression that it just wants to submerge itself in the scary idea surrounding this family, exploring the many different effects it had on them. It takes its time with this story, and I'd argue the ending is just an extension of that. It's not bombastic, rather it casually reminds the player that time is precious, and it should be appreciated, savored. There's no rush here. And perhaps we shouldn't all be chasing that happy ending, expecting everything to be grand at some point in the future. Rather, we should just appreciate the ride, and let it take us wherever it will, and accept whatever happens. You can't run away from it. You can't hide. It's inevitable, and it's gonna happen one way or another, whether you like how it happens or not. Life and death is scary, but they're also beautiful. That's what I took away from What Remains of Edith Finch, and it didn't need to force the idea upon me. Even though it does have abstract and surreal moments, it also didn't obfuscate its themes with the hidden agenda of, appearing smarter. Something a lot of arty games struggle with, and thus they can come across as pretentious. In every way, I found Edith Finch to be such a sincere, authentic experience. One of the most lovingly and diligently crafted pieces of art I've partaken in, showing just how far games have matured as a storytelling medium. It's the kind of thing you show to someone to demonstrate the value of this crazy, weird hobby of ours. In conclusion, all the games on this list tell stories in different ways, to varying degrees of success, whether it be through brilliantly directed cinematics like in Wolfenstein, environmental storytelling like in Little Nightmares, Edith Finch and Prey, or through the combination of mechanics and systems like in Prey, or through the friendly competition like in Nidhogg, I guess. But Edith Finch dominated 2017 for me in this regard. Storytelling in games is perhaps the thing I find most important about them. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that means, because it can be achieved in so many different ways, and it could be argued that there's a valuable story in anything. I can feel something significant regardless of whether a game has an intended story or not. I suppose the thing I appreciate most about games isn't necessarily storytelling, but just how much they can resonate with people on an emotional level. I know it can be considered a bad excuse, but it's all a bit complicated and in flux. And as I've stated before, I can only try my best to express why one game shines over another for me. Even over the course of producing these videos, my mentality has changed, and it will continue to do so. This list can be completely different a year from now. Or not. And I suppose even attempting to organize it now is futile. I've spoken about each of these games at length, and in hindsight, the list format has been limiting and a bit pointless in a sense. All I can say for sure is that of all the games I played and completed from 2017, what remains of Edith Finch is the one I recommend most to you at this point in time. However, I obviously think you should give each of the titles here a deeper look, if you can. There's something great in each of them. Anyway, thank you for watching this series. It's been a cool journey, and I've had a lot of fun with it. Hopefully you have also. If you haven't already, let me know what your favorite games of 2017 are at the moment. If you've played any of the games I've addressed, tell me what you think of them in particular. It's always good getting a different perspective on things, and it's also validating knowing someone else felt the same about something as me. Alright then, have a great day. Bye.